If you've been watching this channel since the beginning, you'll remember I always used to come on camera and say, if I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. Back in the day, and still now, today being the example, I always used to come online and make videos when I was too tired to do other, more serious work, things that I cared about. And today is no exception, or today is an example of that old rule, what used to be the norm around here. I woke up at 6:45 in the morning. I had to go down to the train station. It's a long story. And this evening, when I had this guy here hilariously repairing the electricity in my bathroom, I was talking about this stuff and joking about it on a live stream on YouNow with a great audience. We had a great time. We really just hung out for like 2 hours. Wonderful. And, a couple of trolls showed up, but everyone was having such a good time. The trolls also got into the spirit of things and had a good time too. So it was really a beautiful, beautiful experience. We had a lot of fun. And then I went to the gym, and now I'm talking to you again. For that same fundamental reason, I feel too tired to really hit the books, to really get something done intellectually or otherwise. Best of times, worst of times. So this is me on 4 hours of sleep, people. Take me as I am or let me go. Look, this video, the topic, which you've already seen in the title, is a topic that people requested. And I'm happy to comply and put up this video. I will decide later whether this video is going to be up temporarily or permanently. Because as you may have heard me say many times on this channel, just like saying if I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. Another thing I've said many, many times is that I always like to make videos that will still be meaningful to other people and will still be meaningful to me personally if I came back and watched them 10 years from now. Something that's not just meaningful short term, not just about a controversy of the day. So we'll see how this goes. The question of this one vegan on the internet eating cheese and not caring about it, eating cheese and expressing his indifference, laughing about it, etc., raises all kinds of issues. And some of them are issues that I've already discussed with him face-to-face, in person, and face-to-face via Skype, in some of the interviews we have. He and I have talked about the difference between the man of principle model, where you stand up for the principle of the thing, whether or not you can see the meat, whether or not you can taste the cheese, whether or not you ordered it, whether or not you asked for it, whether or not the principle of the thing is more important, or versus, I suppose, the go-with-the-flow model of being a flexitarian or semi-vegan. So there's a sense in which you guys already know where I stand. However, I think a lot of you will find the content of the remainder of this video a little bit surprising and hopefully a lot enlightening. My first university degree is in political science. I'm not a specialist in Afghanistan. I'm not a specialist in Iraq. However, anyone who's seriously interested in politics in the last 20 years has to some extent developed an interest in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And I actually was interested in that part of the world before September 11, 2001, partly just because of the particular professors I had in the particular university program where I studied political science. I read an account once of one of these bizarre public education programs that the United States supported in Afghanistan. And this was an education program not aimed at children but aimed at adults, and trying to change some fundamental religious, social, and cultural attitudes toward women, toward education, toward the way society is organized. And so this program was addressing things like arranged marriage. And arranged marriage in that culture, partly it means the question of whether or not a woman has the right to choose her own husband, as opposed to having her father choose her husband for her. But partly it also deals with child marriage versus adult marriage, so people being married at too young an age. Partly it deals with inbreeding, with whether or not people are marrying their cousins, etc. And this program, this education program that was really engaging local religious leaders in debate, local kind of village elders in debate, the local equivalent of the mayor, leaders of public opinion. And the other big question was of women's education. And they were trying to engage these people in debate, many of whom were members of the Taliban, and other, some were not members of the Taliban, but were extremely conservative Muslims, and trying to, within an extremely fundamentalist and somewhat fanatical social setting, trying to convince them that their own religion, their own culture, really did not call for women to be kept illiterate forever, for women to be unable to choose their own husbands, etc., etc. So that was a very careful argument for them to advance, because the people doing this, the reality is they're employees of the American government, so they have a very obvious agenda. It's very obvious who's paying the bills and why the whole public education program exists. But they were trying to debate with these people on their level within the Muslim religious schema, and in many cases, they say they won. How effective was the program really? I have no opinion. But I'm reading this article that's describing the program as a success, and there's a very interesting moment of reflection in this program where one of these men, I think he's some kind of village elder, just a respected older gentleman in a village in Afghanistan. He asked the question. He said, look, I know how these things were done in my grandfather's time. I know how these things were done in my father's time. But I know how we did them in this village just 10 years ago. And he referred to his own family situation, exactly these issues, arranged marriage, women's education versus women's illiteracy. And he said, how do we know when to make the change, when the reality of the change we're making is an offense to our own grandparents, is an offense to our own tradition, is an offense to our own culture and our own way of doing things just 5 years ago, just 10 years ago, and of course 100 years ago, and so on. And the answer that was given by the local religious leader, this is a Muslim cleric who had very gradually been convinced by this basically American propaganda program. The answer he was given is the obligation to make the change comes as soon as we know. Before we were ignorant, there was no obligation on us to do the right thing because we did not know. As soon as we know, we have to make the change. Interesting. Now, there was more to it. There's a whole context of Islamic jurisprudence, Islam as a religion, Muslim culture, but the simplicity of that being tied to, of course, a monotheistic and totally non-democratic worldview, to me, of course, it's just a moment that stays with me. It's a moment that leaps off the page in contrast to the sort of ethical debates we engage in within veganism, animal rights, ecology, and within democratic forums, shall we say. As soon as you know, there's the obligation to make the change. Doesn't matter what your parents believe, what your grandparents believe. So many of you watching this are vegans who already sympathize with why I raised this. Many of you are vegans who will have had conflicts with your own parents or with your own grandparents. Some of you just recently at Thanksgiving. Some of you in the next 30 days are going to go to Christmas or Hanukkah. You're going to deal with exactly those questions in some sense. And you are not going to be able to get away with presenting an ethical argument that simple and that simplistic. So, we all go through these situations where you order something in a restaurant, you think it's vegan, it arrives and it's not. When is the obligation on you to act? As soon as you know. I go through these things in many languages of reading ingredients, and sometimes reading ingredients very carefully. The ingredients are written in English, the ingredients are written in Chinese, the ingredients are written in Thai or Cambodian or some other language, because I've lived in all these strange countries. Sometimes I buy things and I don't know they contain some kind of animal product. The obligation on me to act comes as soon as I do know. Right? Very simple. So I digress for one more anecdote here. I have really two big anecdotes in mind, but here's a little one in the middle. If you think it doesn't make a positive impact in the world, it does. There was a bakery in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Victoria is a small city, and it was a so-called artisanal bakery, which just means it's expensive. So, some of the loaves of bread in this bakery are $5. Probably some of them are like $7. The bread could be very pricey. They tried to make different types of fancy bread. And I would go in and I would have to ask every time, is this bread vegan? And they didn't know. The only way they could find out whether or not a particular bread on a particular day was really vegan was for them to phone the baker who did the work that day, because they mixed up their recipes. So like on a given day, a certain type of bread might or might not have egg wash on it. or might not have some parmesan used in it, or might not have some other non-vegan ingredient. They really didn't know. I guess, again, this is part of their artisanal style. They don't want to be like a corporate bakery. I'm guessing they encourage their bakers to mix it up a little bit from day to day or week to week to make things, a little bit unpredictable. Now, I didn't punish them. Sometimes when I ask this question, I'd say, okay, can I buy this bread or not? I'm vegan. Can you check? Sometimes the result was that I would buy nothing. I would have to leave the store empty-handed, so they wouldn't move it. Sometimes I would just have to buy the cheapest plain white bun, which they made. They made a simple, what we call a dinner roll, to have a very simple white bread, because that was the only thing I was really certain was vegan. Their loss. So they're selling me a 50-cent bun or a couple of 50-cent buns instead of a $5 loaf of bread. These are Canadian prices. And in Canadian cities, it's very common to see a loaf of bread for $5. But anyway, Canadian dollars, Canadian prices. Okay. And the last time I talked to them, because this happened repeatedly, the last time I talked to them, the woman who was the boss, I don't know if she was the manager or the owner, but she was some kind of boss, she just said to me, she said, look, you know what? We need to be better organized, because whenever we get these questions, of course, whether it's from a vegan or maybe it's from someone who's just lactose intolerant, someone who has another reason, we never know the answer. So, you know what? I got to talk to the chef. We got to get organized. So we have a written list every day about what is or isn't vegan. I said, great. It's a small change in the world, but if I had behaved like this other YouTuber and just pretended I didn't know or didn't care, if I just blindly ate bread that had cheese in it and was indifferent, in that small way I wouldn't make the world a better place. And of course, this type of conversation is part of the difference between veganism being a visible minority or an invisible minority, which is very important. I'm not going to get into that at length here. It's a topic I've talked about in many videos. I think part of the dynamism and strength of the gay rights movement was that gay people made a transition from being an invisible minority to being a visible minority, a highly visible minority. It's possible, if you're gay, most gay people can pretend to be straight. They can choose to be invisible, right? But, the difference between homosexuality in the 1930s and homosexuality in the 1990s, a big part of it was the transition from being invisible to being visible. So yes, being vegan in a visible way, just in that small way of when you go to the bakery saying, look, I got to check. I think this bread is vegan, but is it? Obviously, you don't ask that about bread that's labeled as bacon bread, or you don't ask that about bread that's labeled as cheese loaf. But sure, with bread that could be or should be or might be vegan, it's totally reasonable to ask that, engage in that, and you are making that small difference. Now look, sorry, I by blood I'm Jewish. I think I could lie and not be Jewish. I've met and talked to Jewish people who are religious Jews. I'm an atheist. I'm a nihilistic atheist. And for them also, that's part of the reason. For them to go into shops and check, does this contain pork? Is this kosher? For them to talk to people in shops about their dietary rules, it's partly because they want the shop owners to know, we're out here. We're not an invisible community. We're a visible community. We're some of your customers. We're looking to buy this stuff. Like, whether that's a labeling challenge or an ingredient challenge, some of them want to do that. Now, fundamentally, I don't sympathize with any supernatural dietary requirements. I don't sympathize with them within Judaism, nor within Buddhism, nor any other religion. But I just say that's an interesting parallel, where again, there's a question of visible versus invisible, and a question of very polite, gradual suasion on those institutions, whether they're restaurants or bakeries or what have you. Right? This still ain't activism, folks. This is just living your life. This is just normal daily life. This is just the struggle as a vegan, right? Activism is a whole nother question. Part of the reason why this channel exists is not just to talk about the politics of veganism, not just to talk about the rational elements of veganism, but to talk about the emotional elements and indeed the irrational elements. Okay? Keeping it all the way real. Now, I've got a disclaimer here. I'm going to say it after the anecdote also. I do not support or endorse violence of any kind. I don't support violent protest. I don't support I don't support any of the excuses for violence made by other vegans such as Gary Yourofsky. I do not support violence even against laboratory technicians who perform experiments on animals. Not at all. I only endorse democratic, nonviolent methods of social change, especially if you're living in a democratic country such as Canada, the United States, Germany, etc. I don't know if anyone watching this channel is really living in a non-democratic country. Maybe a few. But most of my advice is being addressed to people who really have the right to vote and lobby government and go to city hall and organize dissident movements, etc. If you live in a country where you have none of those rights, none of those options, that's probably another story, and somebody has to talk about it on another YouTube channel. With that having been said, there was a guy, and I'm not going to say who he was, and I'm not going to say where I was. I am going to lie and say that this happened in Malaysia. It did not, but we're going to pretend it happened in Malaysia because I want to make this story more anonymous. Okay. There was a guy, and I had been a friend to him, and he had been a friend to me. At one point, I had invited him into my own house and had him as a house guest. He had met my girlfriend at the time. I had cooked food for him in the past. I had been a host to him, taking care of him. And at one point, in Malaysia, he was a host to me. And I did not speak the local language. I couldn't communicate in Malay. And he knew how seriously I took vegetarianism at the time. So at the time, I was strictly vegetarian. I wasn't yet vegan. I've talked about that in earlier videos. The process of me becoming vegan. At that time already, though, I refused to wear leather, refused to eat eggs. In many ways, I was very, very close to vegan in my ethical beliefs and in my diet, but I was not at that time 100% vegan. But he knew how serious it was, and he said that he was a vegetarian. He was serious about vegetarianism also. That's what he said. And not once, but repeatedly, he went with me to a grocery store, and he bought for me a type of bread. And this was basically like a bread with herbs, like a focaccia type of bread. So it was a bread with some flavoring, some herbs on it. I couldn't taste anything. It didn't taste like it had any egg in it. It didn't taste like it had anything. There was no cheese. So whatever non-vegan invites, it absolutely seemed to be vegan to me, right? And he went with me the first time, and he explained to me what it was, and he talked to the woman behind the counter in the local language, and he confirmed, yeah, this is totally right. And he said that he ate it himself all the time, and he was vegetarian. Okay? So I didn't see him for a while. I don't know, let's say so I ate it a couple of times with him for that reason, this bread from this particular store. And then I didn't see him for a week, let's say. These are approximate times. And during that week I ate it a couple more times. And then I did see him again. And when he saw that I bought it, he laughed at me. And I could tell from his laughter something was wrong. He was like, "Oh, you still buy this stuff?" I was like, "Yeah." And it's like, it's because it's the bread you confirmed was, vegan, vegetarian, whatever you want to say. Like, this is the bread that's safe for me to buy because you talk to the person. I can't speak the language here, And, while he was talking to me, I was eating the bread. And he laughingly and casually said that, in fact, this bread contained beef tallow. And the moment he said that, the moment I knew, I spat out the bread that was in my mouth, I put the bread down, and I never ate it again. And now it must be a trace amount. And actually, in his whole story, in his laughing way, he told this whole story that no, actually, when he asked the woman behind the counter, she admitted or she stated that it contained some trace amount of beef tallow, of I assume beef fat. And again, it was so little, I really can taste most impurities, so I assume it is really a tiny amount of beef. But it's the principle of the thing. And again, my purpose on this channel is to keep it all the way real and talk about emotional and irrational aspects of veganism. And when I put that bread down, I was sitting there looking at him. I didn't feel angry. I felt cold. And I was thinking through completely rationally whether or not I was going to murder this guy. Now, some of you may say that's irrational. Again, I don't endorse violence for any political purpose. I don't recommend violence in your life. Well, it was rational, and I came to the rational conclusion that I was not going to kill him. I just have the level of honesty to come on camera and tell you I thought that all the way through. And the situation we were living in Malaysia, again, not really Malaysia, I could have done it very easily, and I would have gotten away with it. There wouldn't have been any problem in that sense in terms of law enforcement. Not an issue. Not an issue. I will digress just to say, for me personally, there have to be extraordinary circumstances to use violence against someone. But the most ordinary of those extraordinary circumstances for me, from my perspective, is that this person is not just a threat, they're an ongoing threat. Where, in other words, if you don't use violence to stop them, they're not just going to cause a problem for you now, they're not just a threat against you now, they're going to continue to be a problem. They're going to continue to instigate violence or do something else very seriously wrong in the world, again and again, to others, or possibly to you again, or what have you, where violence is necessary to stop violence. And again, I actually, sorry, this is totally unscripted, spontaneous video. I don't even like the word necessary, where your reason for using violence is to stop further violence. That's basically the only situation in which I would be able to convince myself of that sort of thing. So as I say, that's very extraordinary. That's the most ordinary of extraordinary circumstances that I can attribute to that kind of thing. Again, even in the comments below this video, even in anonymous comments, I don't know how many people are willing to come forward and say, yeah, when someone crosses you like that, when someone intentionally lies to you, when someone makes a mockery out of the moral principles you choose to live your life by, that you think through whether or not you're going to kill them, when somebody doesn't just cross that line, but they trick you into crossing that line, this is really the opposite of this other YouTuber who just has the relaxed attitude of let it all hang out, and who he sits down in a restaurant. Unlike me, he sits down in a restaurant, he orders something, it turns out it has cheese on it, and he just laughingly, in a relaxed way, eats the cheese. Well, I guess the advantage of his approach to life is that it doesn't cross his mind. The things that cross my mind. I now, again, being honest with you, I got it under control. I've never had a single violent outburst of that kind in my entire life. I doubt I ever will. I'm now 38 years old. I have talked to other vegans who do not have it under control. I have talked to vegans who get into fist fights over trivialities. There are vegans who lose their temper. And I can sympathize. But sure, I'm here to say it's bad and it's wrong. So the vegan who laughingly just eats cheese when it's convenient to eat cheese because they don't want to make a fuss, it's bad and it's wrong. But I've also got to say, living the way I live, this whole man of principle thing, it's not for everybody. Because some people are going to snap. And that also is bad and it's wrong. Hit me up.